Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Kara Alaimo and Laura Apperson. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Kara Alaimo is author of the new book, Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back. She is a communications professor at Farley Dickinson University and has been writing for CNN Opinion about the social impact of social media. I thought I had a typo there, and issues affecting women and girls since 2016. Laura Apperson is an editor who specializes in innovative nonfiction that helps readers live fulfilling lives, broadens their understanding of the world, and empowers them to become the best versions of themselves. Currently, she is spearheading the new nonfiction program at Alcove Press. Previously, she was an editor at St. Martin's Press and Rockridge Press. And now let's welcome Kara Alaimo and Laura Apperson.
Thank you so much, Lonnie, and super happy to be here. And thank you everyone for joining us. It was such a dream to edit Kara's book. She's amazing, and she's an amazing researcher and reporter. Here it is. I learned a lot. I'm excited for you all to learn a lot from her today as well. So let's start off with a more general question. Kara, would you mind telling us a bit about your professional history and what motivated you to write this book?
Sure. Well, I teach communication at Farley Dickinson University, where I actually created our university's academic programs in social media. But I've also been writing for CNN Opinion since 2016 about the social impact of social media and issues affecting women and girls. And so many of the stories I tell and the sources I use in this book are very much informed by my reporting for CNN. One of, in my opinion, the most important stories I tell in the book is of a woman named Vivian who read one of my CNN Opinion columns and wrote to me and said, I got my eating disorder on Instagram. And that was a story that I very much wanted to tell in this book. But what motivated me to write this book originally was trying to figure out how I would handle my own daughter's use of social media. And after I finished the book, I went for a walk with my CNN editor, and we both kind of had a laugh about the fact that I had been so naive to think that my biggest problem was going to be handling my own daughter's use of social media. Because I think the realization I came to that kind of wasn't in my original proposal, but that I realized when I sat back and looked at all of my research for this book was that what's happening on social media is making the offline world more dangerous for women and girls. And so it used to be the case circa 7 years ago or so, that, social media was a place where misogynists found one another, but they often congregated on these darker corners of the web, right? So it was Reddit, it was the manosphere, it was the red pill. And what we've seen more recently is that a lot of that misogyny has permeated mainstream social platforms. And so now it's just kind of a common part of youth culture on TikTok to joke about violently abusing women. And that's really unique compared to other forms of extremism in the sense that American teenagers are generally not on TikTok joking about beheading people, for instance. What I think is that this is very much spilling over into the offline world. It's common to use the phrase in real life to talk about what happens offline. And I've come to believe after writing this book that that phrase is not just antiquated, it's dangerous because it suggests that what's happening online is not profoundly impacting our offline lives. One thing I know as a professor of communication is that a wide body of literature tells us that when people are exposed to violence in the media, that is actually correlated with committing acts of violence. So people who witness violence against women are in fact more likely to commit acts of violence against women. And I could throw so many different examples at you because now that I've sort of come to this perspective and sort of come to this argument. I see examples everywhere, but just one of them would be that the CDC put out its youth risk behavior survey last year, which found a significant increase in the percentage of teen girls who said that they'd been forced to have sex between the years 2011 and 2021. And I can't help but trace that, at least in part, back to the fact that people joke about raping women on TikTok and other mainstream social platforms regularly. And so I'm really worried.
Yeah. And thank you for writing this amazing book to help us understand what's really happening online and how it does translate to real life. And we'll talk a lot more about the examples you alluded to. But first, let's start with, so when, your proposal came in and we had our first editorial call, we talked about how to structure the book, and we thought it would be a neat idea to structure it in a narrative arc where the first chapter starts with the first time a girl gets online. And that first chapter is called Girl Meets Instagram. And it starts actually even before like a young woman gets online at her birth. So set the scene for us a little bit. What is sharenting, and how does it affect young women when they do decide to make a social media account later on?
Yeah. So first of all, this is where I see your imprint most powerfully on this book, because you really encouraged me to follow the arc of a woman's life and look at every aspect of our lives, from the teen years to online dating, to how we parent our kids, to our careers. And I think that worked so beautifully in this book. But I start, while a girl or a child of any gender is still in the womb. And that's when many parents, and I'll just fess up to doing it myself, sharent sonogram pictures. And then as kids grow up, a lot of parents share very personal information about their kids online. And having young kids myself, I really understand the impetus for doing this. Some of it is that I do think it's beautiful that my young children growing up have this network of family and friends all over the world who care deeply about them and who are watching them grow up and feel invested and feel connected to them in some way. I don't do it publicly, so I don't do it on X, but I do it to, my group of friends on Facebook. I think, another thing to remember is that parents are often incredibly isolated. And so one thing that I tried to do in this book is not to judge women, because women have the rest of the world for that. And Laura, you really helped me in that editing process, I think, try to get this right. And so I'm not here to judge parents who sharen't. I understand the impetus for it. Last year, one of my children had a really big health scare, and I understood the impetus to share on social media because I was feeling in need of some support myself. But in that instance, I resisted the urge to do it because my child's privacy was ultimately more important. And so I think one thing that we have to look at is that one reason why people are sharing such intimate information about their kids on social media is because we're so isolated. And as a parent, you kind of get that in the sense that your day is so overloaded. And then you finally sit down at 11 at night and take a deep breath, and you might be able to post on Facebook, but you probably can't really call a friend. So I get that. I think that helps explain why the psychologist Marisa Franco says that we're living in a time of friendship famine. So social networks give us the idea that, I'm connected to 2,000 people on Facebook or whatever it is. But that's not really what keeps us healthy. What keeps us healthy is having that one person or two people or a few people you can call at the end of a really bad day. And so, that's more important than diet and exercise. But in any event, so parents are sharing intimate information about their kids. Sometimes it's because they need support. We're trying to feel connected. But I worry about it. I worry about how kids could be judged for that content later on. So one thing I talk about in this book is how the world judges women and girls particularly uncharitably. So one question I suggest parents ask themselves is, will this send my daughter's future presidential campaign into a tailspin if it surfaces a couple decades from now? But in addition to that, I worry about what we're teaching our children. And again, in particular, girls, this idea of constantly posing and presenting themselves for the pleasure of others. And I think it's dangerous. And so I just sort of call on parents to think thoughtfully about what you share. Don't make it diaper pictures. Don't make it the potty training anecdotes, and be mindful of what we're teaching our kids.
Yeah, that's great advice. And you also give more specific advice for maybe like some other ways you can share those more intimate pictures with close friends and family, like different apps, or what are some of those suggestions you include in the book?
Yeah, so maybe it's something like using a close friends feature, right? Just having a small group of people, not like some random guy you met at a conference who friended you on Facebook, but sort of a more closed group for some of those updates, I think is a really great idea.
Yeah, that's an awesome idea. That's a great feature. I love using that too. Um, so great. So now that girl or that child has grown up and they're a teenager and they've made their own social media account. In your research, how have you seen how it affects mental health?
So I think the really interesting thing is that the research is in fact mixed. Big tech CEOs came to testify on Capitol Hill recently, some under the threat of subpoena, but in any event, I covered this for CNN, and Mark Zuckerberg, who owns Facebook and Instagram, looked lawmakers in the eye and said, I'm not so sure the data supports this idea that social media is so bad for kids. How could he say that? It's because I think so much comes down to how kids use it. So one of, in my opinion, the most important stories I tell in this book is of Vivian, who says she got her eating disorder on Instagram. But I also talk about how social media can be a place where kids who are minorities in their physical communities go online, they find their people, they find support systems. It's a place where kids develop interests that turn into careers. It's a place where kids get involved in really important causes. And so I think a lot of it comes down to whether kids get it right. And it's so easy for them to fall down these rabbit holes. So Vivian told me she was really into yoga. So she posted a picture of herself doing a handstand, and that was picked up by a Fitspo page, so-called fitness inspiration. From there, she was sucked into this rabbit hole of very
Yeah.
toxic content. And studies by the Center for Countering Digital Hate and others find, if you pretend to be a 13-year-old girl setting up an account on Instagram and TikTok, and you search for body image content, within minutes, they're going to be promoting tummy tuck surgery and weight loss drinks and suicide content. And so it's just so devastating to fall down that rabbit hole.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely unbelievable that that's something that teenagers find on social media. So, it's really clear that there's a lot going on on social media that can be toxic for teenagers. So, what advice do you offer for parents for handling their daughter's use of it?
So again, I'm not here to judge anyone for your choices. And I would say that I think a lot of kids have understandably ended up on social apps earlier than they otherwise would have because of the pandemic, right? Because they were all stuck home on devices for several years. So if it's not too late, if your kids are very young, like my kids, I think it's really important to start talking to the parents of your kids' friends early when they're very young, and collectively agree that you will hold off on letting your kids get phones and social apps until a particular age. I suggest age 16, which I know sounds like saying age 40. But I will say that research shows, for instance, very solid study out of the UK found that when girls between the ages of 11 and 13 used social networks, that was correlated with lower life satisfaction a year later. And I think some of it is that, that's the age when girls go through puberty, and we already know, their confidence is plummeting. It is such a difficult time to be a human. And then to have all the pressures of social media added on top of that, it just becomes a lot for girls to handle. So if you can, I suggest holding off. But then when your kids do get social networks, first of all, you've got to be talking to them about the dangers that they'll face online. One big thing that's just a common part of youth culture is sharing intimate images. It's sexting. And it's kind of hard for me because I just didn't grow up in that culture to fully
No, me
wrap my
either.
head around it, right?
No.
And so like, I've been talking to so many audiences on this book tour, and the sense from parents is, but not my child. And unfortunately, the data suggests otherwise. The girls I interviewed, many of whom I was put in touch with by their parents, explained to me how it works. They actually take these images in advance and save them on for your eyes only, for my eyes only on Snapchat, so that then when they're asked for them, they have them ready to go, because it's a lot of work to create them. And so, it's just a common part of youth culture, and we have to teach our kids why they can't do it. First of all, they could technically be prosecuted for producing and distributing child pornography of themselves. But also we know that when nude images of a woman end up online, it puts her at greater risk of sexual assault, puts her at greater risk of depression, it puts her at greater risk of suicide, makes it harder for her to find a job, it makes it harder for her to date. It is just absolutely life destroying. And these images can be hacked. They're so-called revenge porn, which I argue in the book is a totally unfair term, but you know what I'm talking about. So that's the first conversation for parents to have with kids. A lot of the other conversations can start even before kids get social networks. So one thing that I'm concerned about in particular is how visually oriented platforms like Instagram put the emphasis on appearances and on people's bodies. And I write in the book that, the so-called Instagram body can usually only be achieved through surgery. But it's really easy to lose sight of that, and just sort of more broadly to get the sense that we judge people based on their appearances. And so one of my intellectual heroes who blurbed this book, Kate Mann, had this book published in January called Unshrinking. And she talked in that book about how, particularly during the pandemic, she would take out her phone, pull up Instagram, and show her daughter pictures of people's bodies, people of all different races and sizes and levels of ability. And what she would say is, I'm so glad they are here in the world with us. And I just thought that was such a powerful way of teaching a child, any person really, not to judge people for appearances, especially yourself. So that's another big one, talking about consent, saying no if someone asks you to do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. And then, a lot of parents who've been in my audiences at these book talks, seem intimidated and tell me, like, I don't know how to have this conversation because I don't know how to create a TikTok. And what I keep saying to parents is, you don't have to understand how to use Snapchat to just educate yourself on what's going on social networks, even by consuming the traditional media. So if you read the New York Times, you know that what's been trending on TikTok recently is Sephora kids and Botox babies content, right? Telling 10-year-olds they need full faces of makeup and telling 20-year-olds they need Botox, which I don't have to say is a really terrible idea. So you can be staying up on that and then having those conversations with your kids.
Yeah, all terrific advice. And yeah, when Kate shared that at your event a couple of weeks ago, I also got chills, like, so brilliant, such a great
So
idea.
beautiful.
Yeah, I love that so much. Well, you touched on this already a little bit in your last answer, but you talked a lot about how, obviously we know the world has always judged women harshly for our appearances. But you argue that social media is making it worse. And you touched on it a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I actually interviewed a plastic surgeon when I was writing this book, and he explained to me why plastic surgery has just skyrocketed since the year 2000 when social networks took off.
Yeah.
And it's because, and I remember this time when I was growing up, you typically had your photo taken when you went to a wedding, when you went to a birthday party, not every day.
Yep.
But now, thanks to social networks, we are constantly confronted with images of ourselves. It might be a picture a friend takes, and you're seeing yourself from all these different angles, and it's just kind of promoting body dissatisfaction. Plastic surgery in particular took off during the pandemic. Plastic surgeons call this the Zoom boom, right? Because everyone was confronted with images of our face on Zoom and decided, many people decided they didn't like what they saw. And so that's what's fueling a lot of this body dissatisfaction. But then I also get into the way that social networks have provided a forum for people to judge women more than ever before. And the moment when I sat down and started writing what became this book would probably seem minor in the context of all the things I discuss in this book. But I was on maternity leave with my second daughter. And because I write for CNN on, breaking news, anytime something happens related to, issues affecting women and girls, everyone in my world texts it to me.
Yeah.
And so I'm feeding my daughter and my husband sends me this text. And the story is that Jill Biden has walked onto an airplane. And she's wearing these stockings. And according to Glamour magazine's website, Twitter broke. And the reason is because people couldn't decide, was she a prostitute? Was she a witch? Was she representing the country well in her unpaid role as America's first lady? And something in me just snapped. It's, this idea that, it used to be a snarky tabloid headline, but now the whole world can come together on social networks and weigh in. And of course, women see what people are writing about them, right? I'm thinking of, Catherine, the Princess of, is it Wales?
Yeah.
Right, it is. All women in and out of the public eye are, I think, profoundly affected by these judgments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Kate Middleton has really been, it's been all over, and it's been crazy. So that's a great example of how, women can receive just insane judgment online.
Especially in this case, while she is on medical leave.
On medical leave, just trying to heal up.
Yeah.
So we're going through our narrative. We're talking about how women are judged harshly for their appearances. And these days, a lot of people, when they're dating and looking for a partner, they're on dating apps. And they can be utterly exhausting for women. I'm married. I was on dating apps for a hot second, like 8 years ago, but a lot of my friends are still on them, and it's tough. I hear a lot of horror stories. And in the book, you note that a Pew survey from 2020 says that the majority of American women say that dating is harder now than it was 10 years ago. Why do you think that is? And how can people who are looking for relationships use these apps effectively?
Yeah. And I'll just note that according to that survey, the majority of men disagree that dating has gotten harder, which is very
interesting. Something. Yeah.
So there is this perception that dating apps have made it easier to meet people. And in fact, dating apps have widened the pool of potential people you can connect with. And, I won't discount that that's particularly important for people who are minorities in their physical communities, right? So members of the LGBTQIA community are far more likely to meet their partners online. So there is something that's important about this. But Americans have this perception that it's easier to date now. And in fact, it is actually more likely that people will be single now than it was before dating apps landed in the scene. So in 2020 and 2021, the marriage rate in the United States hit the lowest number since the federal government began tracking it in 1867. And this is a trend that was well underway before the pandemic. Single Americans are also far less likely to be living with romantic partners than they were a couple decades ago. So my theory on this is that dating apps keep people single, and not just because they have an incentive to, right? Because they lose 2 users if they paired you up. But part of it is that they don't function as advertised. And so, a lot of these sites will claim that if you just answer all of these very intimate questions, you will be matched with someone compatible or even your soulmate. And decades of research tell us that it's not possible to do that because it's not possible to predict whether two people will be compatible by looking at their qualities. So these sites are gathering all of this data, and who knows what they're doing with it, selling it potentially to foreign adversaries, to shady companies, but not really using it to find your soulmate. And then on top of that, like you and I both used dating apps circa 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And I think they've really devolved since then.
And I hated them back then too.
Same. But the thing is that these apps give the impression that there's always another person to swipe on.
Yes.
And research shows that when people perceive they have other options, they value their romantic partners less and are more likely to break up with them. So, the women I interviewed for my book told me a lot of them had stopped using dating apps. One, because they were just sick of being treated terribly by the people they matched with. And then two, because they were telling me that a lot of the people they were supposedly matching with weren't real. And so catfishing is now a huge global enterprise run by these crime syndicates. They'll lure men from places like China to travel to Cambodia. These men think they've gotten like the job of a lifetime, some lucrative job in marketing or something like that. And when they get there, they're basically held as slaves and forced to catfish women, which is where you establish an emotional relationship, perhaps on a dating app. And then you say something like, I have to fly to see you now. And my wallet's been stolen. So, give me your credit card number and I'll pay you back when I get there, or whatever the story is. But the bottom line is they're taking off with your money. And what really surprised me in my interviews was how many brilliant women I know have fallen for this. I interviewed one woman who was one of the most senior women in the world of international diplomacy. She'd been catfished. I did an interview about my book with Dr. Robin Stern, who has the Gaslight Effect podcast. Podcast is called The Gaslight Effect. She told me how she'd been catfished, right? And so I think that the reason why it's harder for women is in part because of the stereotype of a single woman, right? So, a single woman is desperate for a relationship. She's emotional. She's vulnerable. And so women are seen as strong targets. And then just the other thing is safety and dating apps. And so the United States does not keep statistics on how many violent crimes are tied to dating apps, which I think is awfully convenient for these companies. Back in 2019, Columbia Journalism Investigations did what they called an unscientific study because they asked people to take a survey. And it's certainly very possible that people who'd had bad experiences were motivated to share that information by taking the survey. But nevertheless, 31% of women who'd used a dating site, an online dating site over the previous 15 years said that they'd been sexually assaulted by someone they met through one of these sites. And if that number is anywhere close to accurate, I think these sites are just so much more dangerous than any of us realize.
Oh, yeah. No, I have a friend who is recently getting divorced and back on the dating app scene, and it's ugly. She's one of my closest friends, so I'm getting a lot of bad stories. And so much of what you write in the book is true to her experience, and it's awful, and things have to change. So yeah, I mean, we talked about dating apps, and now let's talk about how social media can affect careers. You write about the fact that women use social media to try to bolster their professional profiles. They often end up when they do that, they often end up with fewer followers, reposts, and opportunities than men in their fields. Why is this, and what can we do about it?
So I think a lot of this comes down to the biases that people have that probably did start offline. I think it's fair to say, right? So when people think of an expert, they think of a man, and they tend to turn to men for expertise. When people think of a doctor, they think of a white man, right? And so, as a result, when women try to bolster their professional profiles by using social media, they often really do end up with, as you said, fewer followers, fewer reposts, fewer resulting opportunities like speaking engagements. And this was something I wasn't actually aware of until I started researching this book. But it's one of those places where I think there's a lot of ways that we can enact change pretty quickly. So one of the things I call on all of us to do is recognize this implicit bias and just follow more women experts. I feel so strongly about this. I've actually created a list of feminists to follow and put it on my website, which is just my name, Alaimo.com. And they're, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. But the point is, they're this diverse, amazing group of women doing incredible things in lots of different fields. But I think we have to recognize that and consciously follow women more and consciously amplify their posts and engage with their posts when they share things that we appreciate. And then of course, think about how we post as well. In order to share our expertise and, share about issues that affect our lives rather than making it about the latest memes or things that, don't really empower us in any way.
Yeah. I've seen some positive trends on social media semi-recently of, women following women. It's always really cool to see that. And I hope we can see a lot more of that.
Yeah,
Moving
I'd also
forward.
love to see companies recognize this, right? Like if companies recognized this,
Yeah.
they could make more of a conscious effort to repost the posts of their women employees at all levels. Obviously, I think, a Fortune 500 company should get permission before reposting. But I'm sure a lot of women would appreciate this. If social networks wanted to do something about this, they could very easily alter their algorithms to suggest that people follow women experts more, to amplify their posts more. So this is like far from an intractable problem.
Yeah, absolutely. There could be a lot more done. Yeah.
And that visibility would solve the problem, right? Because with increased visibility, people would come to see women as experts.
Yep. For sure. Absolutely. Well, so, we're talking about women in professional careers. Now let's talk about women who are influencers. You talk a lot about influencers in the book, and it's one of my favorite chapters in the book. A lot of us have the impression that influencers are people who make tons of money, make more money than any of us. But you actually write that they're often exploited. Why is this?
Yeah. So I interviewed women influencers for this book, many of them. And my theory is that these are women who 20 years ago would have been freelance writers for the New York Times and for women's magazines. So we all know that, when you have caregiving responsibilities, whether it's a parent, whether it's children, it's really hard to balance that with a corporate job where you're expected to pick up your kids at school at 3:30 in the afternoon and also be in the office until 6 or 7 p.m. at night, right? So many women are looking for flexible forms of work. A lot of that used to be freelance writing, but now, of course, the advertising money that used to go to newspapers and magazines, which would allow them to pay their freelancers a bit more decently, all of that, or a lot of that, goes to Facebook and Google now. And so a lot of women have migrated to these platforms, trying to develop followings that are big enough that would allow them to charge companies for their posts. The majority of teenagers today say they'd like to be influencers. I describe it as the new version of the American dream. But the reality is that most influencers, the vast majority, are women, and the vast majority make far below the federal poverty level. And so this is a lot of work that I think often isn't visible to people. I explain how, the advertising industry is predominantly run by men, and men who work in the advertising industry create very similar content, but it's done by whole teams who come up with storyboards and stage scenes and get props and get music rights and shoot and edit videos. And if you're an influencer, you're like one person doing all of that work. You have to follow loads of people and respond to comments in order to keep your follower counts up. A lot of women who I interviewed told me that they felt intensely pressured to overshare intimate information about their lives. pictures of the interiors of their bedrooms, information about their romantic relationships and their children, because that's what followers expect of women in particular, right?
Yeah.
In order to feel like they know you in some way, or in order to feel like you're authentic.
Authentic, yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
and of course, as I write, like no one tells men who work in advertising that they're not authentic for peddling lipstick and tampons. But somehow, women who do all sorts of things, including influencing, are prone to this charge that they're not authentic. And so,
Yeah.
of course, one of the things they have to do is surround all of their sponsored content with lots of unpaid content to be seen as authentic. They often come under fire from their followers and are charged with not being authentic, for taking money from brands. Brands radically underpay women as influencers. So the pay gap between men and women who influence is far greater than the overall pay gap in the United States. And so it's pretty ugly for women in this profession. And the other thing is that it's very easy to hate on influencers. So on the other side of this, one of my events in particular was attended by a ton of therapists who told me, their clients come to them and they see all this stuff on social media and they feel like their lives, can't match up.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to blame influencers for creating this culture. But what the influencers told me is that like their homes aren't pristine, their kids aren't very well behaved. It's just that they feel like they need to project these lives in order to attract, again, brand sponsors, right? So as I write, no one wants to buy products so they can look like harried women with misbehaved kids and messy homes, right? So they have to project this life that they're not actually living. And then on the other side of it, women see all this content and we feel less than, and it's just a very ugly system.
Yeah, benefits nobody. Everyone loses.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine that life, just trying to maintain that intense follower count. I'm editing a book on perfectionism right now, so that's a lot on my mind, just feeling like the pressure of perfectionism in that space. That exploitation is awful.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to talk about, motherhood. You have two really amazing chapters about how misinformation is targeted specifically to mothers, especially when it comes to healthcare for themselves and their children. Can you tell us more about this and what we can do about it?
Yeah. So I think mothers are very vulnerable targets for misinformation. I think it's the one kind of so-called fake news that we aren't largely talking about.
Yeah.
And part of it is because we're isolated. So everyone knows that when you've just given birth or adopted a child, you're often like sticking close to home. You may be physically recovering. You're trying to protect your newborn from germs that can be deadly in the first weeks of life. And then there's so much you have to learn. How do I get this human to sleep and to eat? How do I keep this child alive? And there's so much doubt that comes with it. And so women are increasingly home. And one thing I know from my own experience is that like one of the few things you can do when you spend hours like feeding an infant is scroll on your phone, right? Looking for those answers.
Yeah.
And so moms are isolated and they're increasingly online. And as a result of that, sometimes they're targets of misinformation that is potentially unintentional. And so I look at how, particularly if you're a stay-at-home mom, there are very few opportunities to get validation in our society, right? And so a lot of mothers will create these videos explaining how they get their kid to magically sleep through the night or whatever it is. And one thing I know from having two children is that every child is different. And so what works for one child doesn't necessarily work for another. But these moms are saying they don't, they have all the answers. And sometimes this is very dangerous information, right? It's coming from people who unfortunately just don't have the expertise to share it. I'm thinking in particular about the recent national shortage of baby formula, where you had people creating videos telling parents how to create infant formula at home. And of course, there's no safe way to do it. Infant formula requires a complex mix of nutrients that cannot be purchased at the grocery store, but all of these videos are out there. And, it's leaving mothers feeling like, why can't I do that? Like she can get her kid to sleep. And the answer is because your kid is different from hers and the circumstances of your life are different, right? But then there's the people who very much prey on women because they know we're vulnerable. So everyone knows that a mother will do anything to help her child. And so when a child has been given a devastating medical diagnosis, perhaps it's a severe form of autism, people, sort of jump in and sell those mothers, these quack essential oils at vast cost because they know, again, that moms will try anything, that these women are isolated. It's exactly how anti-vaxxers have preyed on women, right? Knowing that we're vulnerable because we love our kids so much. And again, moms often don't have a lot of other opportunities to get out into the offline world, right? We're, trying to keep everything afloat at home.
Yeah.
And so it's really scary.
Yeah, there's an insane amount of misinformation out there. What do you recommend to those mothers when they're feeling like, what do I do? Where do I get these answers if I can't get them online?
So I have this radical idea that if you have a question about your child, you call their pediatrician. And I know it's not that easy because I can hear the hold music for my children's pediatrician in my head right now. And it's not that simple, but just we can't get our medical information on social media. It's just too dangerous.
Yeah.
And then with other stuff, I say, you watch a video and this mom has advice. If it's not dangerous and it works for you, phenomenal. But if it doesn't work, the takeaway isn't that you are a failure. The takeaway is your child is different and your life is different.
Yeah, great advice. Yeah, pediatricians know all the good facts. It's a great piece of advice and a good reminder.
And they know your child's medical history, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they're the best person to advise. Okay, so we talked a lot about this at the very beginning of the conversation, but I'm excited to hear more of what you have to say about this. You talk a lot in your book that social media has made the offline world less safe for women. How so, and why is this happening?
So I think what's happening on social media, all of the misogyny that I have described, is normalizing the idea that it is okay to think of women in these terms, to harbor this extreme hatred of women, to give it voice in our society, and even to, commit acts of violence against women. So I mentioned the CDC report, some other places where I've seen this. The overthrow of Roe versus Wade. We've talked about many of the factors that went into it. Certainly, a decades-long fight by right-wing groups, no question. Decade-long efforts to pack the courts, no question. But, what made members of the Supreme Court think that it was politically and socially feasible to take away a right that women enjoyed that could potentially save their lives? And I have to trace some of this back to the normalization of abusing women on social networks. And so I just think that this is permeating so much further than we realize. And I have some ideas for how to combat it. So first of all, most social media companies claim that they don't allow, violence, hatred on their sites, and we can find this kind of content all over their sites. And so I recommend that when we see it, we file a report with the social media company we see it on and make them aware that this content is violating their terms of service. Now, social media companies are notorious for not responding to these reports or for responding and telling women that the rape threats they received did not, in fact, violate the community standards. But if we all did this in mass, I do think it would send a very powerful network message to social networks that we are demanding that they remove this content from their platforms.
For sure.
A couple other things. If you see a woman being abused online, it's very tempting to clap back and to respond to the person who's posted it. But I argue that that's generally not a good idea because doing so boosts its engagement, which sends a signal to algorithms that people like it and want to see more of it. And so I suggest, giving trolls the most devastating response possible in modern times, which is ignoring them. But then if you know the person who's posting or commenting on these things, talk to them offline. Do what feminist Loretta Ross calls calling people in for a respectful offline conversation about why you're troubled by their content, because we have to socially stigmatize it. And then the last thing is known as positive slamming. So if you see a woman attacked online, post something positive about her, a compliment, promote something she's done in her career. And I think if we all, changed the way we react to this kind of content on social media, we could ultimately change the culture on these networks.
I think that's my favorite one, boosting a woman for all of her accomplishments and who she is and how great she is. We need more of that anyway. And I think that's such a powerful way to fight back against trolling like that. Love that one. Really. So we've been talking a lot about feminism in this conversation today, but you talk very eloquently about how social media can be an amazing tool for feminist activism, just like Me Too and the Women's March, but that a lot of what we can see online, even when it's supposedly about feminism, isn't really empowering women. Can you share some examples and what we can do about it?
Yeah. So I look at femvertisements. So these videos created by companies telling women we can solve all our own problems if we just, feel confident and act, know that we're beautiful and buy the right products, of course. And I think it's problematic, to say the least, that companies have been the source of so much of the so-called feminist content that people have been sharing on social networks. I argue that it all started with Dove's Real Beauty campaign, which started off social media. But, this campaign that told women, you're beautiful no matter what you look like. And by the way, they airbrushed their models. The parent company ran campaigns at the same time, sending the very opposite message to men when promoting Axe deodorant. I could go on, but there's plenty of reason to believe that these companies don't buy into their own messages. Yeah. But I also think, companies are part of the problem when we think about empowering women and when we think about what holds us back. I think about the fact that companies don't pay women and men the same salaries for the same work often, or this expectation for overwork, which is what creates so many of the disparities between men and women in our culture, right? Because after women have children, they're viewed as not fully committed to their jobs. And after men have children, of course, they get raises. And so there's a lot that we have to call on companies to do. And so, another just sort of big takeaway from this book is let's radically rethink what we share on social media and what we amplify. Let's post about issues that affect our lives. Let's amplify the posts of women and people of all genders when they post about issues that affect our lives or content that empowers women. And let's call out companies and lawmakers and literally, tag them demands. I think it can be easy to fall into the trap of virtue signaling. And so I do think that it's important to post about issues that we care about. And as a communication professor, I know that's often the first step towards changing public opinion, mobilizing public will. It's great. But we can't stop there. And even something as simple as having a call, a demand, a call to action, and, tagging the right people can start to build momentum for some actual offline change.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for setting the example in this book by providing so many calls to action. There are tons of those all throughout the book and lots of solutions. So we've been talking a lot about so many terrible things that can happen online. So it might make us want to just delete all of our apps. But you suggest that that's not the right solution. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, for this book, I interviewed a huge diverse group of women and girls, and I generally think it's important to listen to women when they speak. And so I've tried to take that to heart on my book tour. And I wanted to acknowledge that so much of what I've been hearing from the women in my audiences is that I deleted Instagram and my life has never been better. And I just want to say, like, the power to you, like, everyone should do what works for our lives. But what bothers me is when women are told, if social media is so toxic, why do you use it at all? And I think one, social networks are places where we can empower ourselves, where we can find jobs and network with people in our careers. And, I connected with so many of my sources for this book on social networks. And obviously, social networks allow us to get involved in causes we care about. I could go on and on. And so I reject the idea that women should give up a very powerful tool for empowering ourselves simply because other people don't want to treat us appropriately on these platforms. But beyond that, I don't think the solution would work because this all comes back to how we started this conversation, right? What's happening on social media is making the offline world more terrible for women and girls. And so even if you and I like shutter our social networks, these misogynists will continue doing what they're doing. And so the solution, of course, is to fix what's wrong with social media. And it's just like really past time for tech companies to get their arms around this and to stop tolerating the abuse of women on their platforms. I trace a lot of this back to how these social platforms came into existence, largely created by men and often a particular kind of man who, may have had a history of trolling women himself. But I just think it's really time for tech companies to get serious about removing this abuse. And, part of the way that they'll do that, of course, is by hearing from users like us that, we demand that they take action.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So I'd love to talk a little bit more too, just about individual, besides, uplifting other women online, empowering other women online, boosting platforms online. Are there any other individual solutions that you share in the book? I know there are for how we can help make social media a more empowering place.
Yeah. So, as you say, like every chapter of my book ends with a section called What We Can Do About It. And I don't, in any way want to suggest that, the onus is only on us because I have loads and loads of demands for lawmakers and tech companies. But ultimately, so many women have been leaving my book talk saying they're horrified and they're worried, and we should be horrified and worried. So I'm glad to hear that. But I guess, I do try to end this book on a message of hope by saying that there are, realistic things that we can all do to change this culture. And so a lot of it is, if we all used our social platforms to post about issues affecting women, algorithms would change overnight, right? Algorithms show us what they think we want to see. And so if this is what we posted and amplified and those around us did the same thing, social networks would become radically different places. So I think ultimately it's about following more women. It's about radically rethinking what we share, and then it's radically rethinking what we do when we witness sexism and misogyny online. And I think if we all did those three things, we could really use social networks to empower ourselves and other women and to improve our lives online and off.
Yeah, for sure. And when you feel like you really want to call somebody out online, to avoid, making the algorithm, giving the algorithm what it wants. You suggest, I think, DMing people. Is that the right idea? If you feel like it's somebody you know or somebody you sort of know, what do you suggest there?
If it's someone you do not know, I think you report it to the social network and don't think it's futile because if we all did this, we could, we could affect change. If it's someone you do know, yeah, it's picking up the phone. It's like stopping them in a very friendly way,
Yeah.
right? At the when you run into them, maybe it's a neighbor and, and saying like, could I have a coffee with you? Like, I want to have a conversation with you in a very non-threatening way. But saying like, I'm troubled by this, or here's how this affects me. And or your daughter, right? And I do think there's plenty of very overt sexism and misogyny, but one thing I was talking about at one of my recent book events was, recognizing it, right? Like I'm a big fan of Kate Mann's work, and she defined what sexism is and what misogyny is, right? So sexism is men thinking they're better than women, and misogyny is men punishing women for causing them displeasure. Once you educate yourself, right, you start to see this everywhere.
Yeah.
And so then we can have these conversations with the people in our lives, and try to change the culture. And I guess, the really crazy thing is that misogyny has become so widespread. I interviewed this one expert who said, like, everyone at this point has a friend who's sharing this on social media. And in fact, I do. So there's a lot of opportunity to have these conversations. Hi there.
Hey,
Hi
Lonnie.
I wasn't sure if Laura was going to say something, so I was pausing.
Oh
for-
no, I saw you pop in, so I figured you'd take over.
I am. Thank you, Laura, for a nice interview with Kara. We really
course.
appreciate it. Kara, there was a couple questions that came in. I'd like to share one, but before I go there, I want to remind folks that both Kara and Laura will be at After Hours. The way that you get to come to After Hours, we've been putting links in chat throughout the event, but we just put another one, or Anne Marie's about to pop in the link. I'm not sure if the link is in there yet. Yeah, there it is. Okay, good. You buy a copy of Kara's book from our partner indie bookseller, The Bookstall. In your email receipt will be the link to register for After Hours. So come support the book and then come hang out, ask your own questions, dive in deeper on the pieces that you really want to know more about. After Hours is a great way, and we're going to spend almost another hour with these two nice folks. So please do join us. It's going to be great. I want to give a quick question from Cheryl, who posted a question during the event. She says, can you share your thoughts on the Kids Online Safety Act? And if passed, what will tech companies' response be?
Yeah, it's really hard. I don't know. So a lot of the emphasis has been on, protecting kids from predators, and I think tech companies are doing more. But it's really hard to know whether this will propel the change we need. I think it's kind of like just the start. And so I think it remains to be seen. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you on that one.
Okay, thank you. I think your internet waffled a little bit there, but I think we got.
Did I freeze for a minute?
Good.
Yeah, you're actually frozen right now.
Oh wait, there you are. You're back.
Okay, now you're back. Okay, good.
Okay. Okay, great.
You're good. And then there was a question for Deb. We're at 6:58, so we have time for one more question. Deb had asked during the event, can you talk, if you have knowledge about this, can you talk about the intersection of ADHD, social media use, and gender?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can talk about the intersection with gender, but I guess just what I'd say is that this is one of my biggest concerns and one of the biggest generational changes that I think we've seen. There's a study done very recently that found half of kids are getting something like over 230 notifications a day on their phones. And, Lonnie and I were talking about this before our event. It is not possible to multitask. It's not how our brains developed. And so a child cannot effectively learn and do something like their homework while receiving dozens and dozens and dozens of pings from their friends. And so I think one of the most important things that parents can do is find ways for kids to put their devices aside when they're concentrating, reading a book, doing their homework. That's why reading physical books is so great. I'm not sure if boys or girls are more affected by this phenomenon. I think it's like disastrous for kids of all genders. And, I'm a fan of being reasonable in the way that parents set policies and setting these policies together with our kids. So there will be all sorts of exceptions when a kid needs to use their phone to do research for their homework, when a kid is worried about a sick family member, right? Why, you allow the notifications. But in general, I think that this is one of the big reasons why we need screen-free time so that kids can learn how to concentrate, learn how to read a physical book. And I think we're already beginning to see the problems and a lot of outcomes that schools are documenting, right? That kids like don't have the focus and attention. And that's one of the key things that kids need to learn in school and from a young age.
I appreciate that. Well, we're right at 8 o'clock, so thanks for ending right on time. Laura, Kara, we'll see you have a 5-minute break in between. We'll open up the Zoom and we'll let folks in. 8:05. Thanks for joining us tonight. And we're going to be doing some in-person programming in April. Hope to see some of you in person who live locally, but we will also keep programming on Zoom as well. So just because we're doing some in-person, have no fear for those of you who don't live nearby, where our in-person events are. Those will be recorded, but then we are also still doing plenty of stuff on Zoom. So thanks for joining us, and we hopefully see a lot of you in about 5 minutes. Thanks so much.